That's funny. Hello and welcome back to PHIL-1024, Searching for Reality at Fanshawe College, Week 6. A couple announcements before we begin. We are heading towards the kind of the break. It's going to happen pretty soon. So we have some assignments that are coming due. I'd like to point your attention especially to the midterm. Let me just actually close my slides and go to our home page over here. We have a midterm exam. It's going to be open for quite a span of time here. So I know we're all working remotely. You might be in different time zones. So it's open for basically a week. It's going to open June 11th. It's going to close June 18th. So you have a big span of time there. Please complete that midterm exam. The browser is not going to be locked down. There's no proctoring software. Just answer the questions as best you can. Open book, open notes, open Google, really. Just read the questions and answer them. That's kind of the pedagogical purpose here. There's also a short essay worth 15% of your grade due June 18th. I really want to get those in before the 19th, just because you have your midterm grades released the 19th there. And I want you to have like an idea of your standing in the class, how well you're doing as you head into the break. After the break, my colleague Ed Matthews, really fantastic guy, is going to be taking over. I'm on vacay July and August, which is really nice because working from home with a couple kids. My 9-month-old is teething. I did not sleep last night. Working from home is a little challenging. If you have any questions, you have any concerns about the topic, the class, my expectations, getting work done, just send me an email. Anything you need, just let me know as we work through this online class. All right, let's talk a little bit about this week's content. So we're still reading Sophie's World, of course. We are reading about Descartes, about the Renaissance, the Baroque period. I have a lot of slides on this, so I'm just going to try and keep it to 45 minutes or so, even though I have about 50 slides. When I teach this, not online, I like to have 3-hour lectures. 1 2-hour class and an hour class, or 2 90-minute classes, just to really be able to give this material its due, to do it justice. But I'm going to try to keep this under an hour. Also, I have to go cook dinner at 4 o'clock. So 4 o'clock, I'm out of here. So Garter talks about the Renaissance period and the Baroque period. So what is the Renaissance? The Renaissance is a period in history that kind of signals the end of the medieval period. And we call it the Renaissance in part because it's a rebirth. The Renaissance. Naissance is French for birth, so the rebirth, partially due to a number of concurrent events happening, right? Cultural events, philosophical events, technological events. In particular, from the point of view of a philosophy class, the rediscovery of a lot of the lost Greek and Roman classics is really kind of a watershed moment in the development of Western philosophy. And when I say Western, I mean, of course, as I've said before, right, we want to make sure we remember that the world is not cloistered. A lot of these lost Greco-Roman classics came to us through translations through the Arab world. So the Renaissance is all about kind of the rediscovery and the rebirth of after the relative stagnation of the medieval period. Periodization has, of course, its detractors, its problems. But if we're going to have a period, we're going to talk 14th century, right, around 1300s in Italy. Spreads across Europe. We're talking about a period that goes about to the 17th century, 300-odd years. It is characterized by a number of things, like a humanistic focus. Return to the human. I think as the poet Horace once said, I am human and therefore nothing human is alien to me. All the variety of human experience is something to be understood, celebrated, studied. There's a return to classical scholarship, a focus on poetry, grammar, history, philosophy, rhetoric, not just theology, in other words. Garter emphasizes, for example, 1486, the oration on the dignity of man. We can just kind of click on that link here. It is by Pico della Mirandola, a philosopher, talking about the potential of human achievement, dignity in the study of the liberal arts, the importance of the human quest for knowledge, all kind of definitely Renaissance values here. How do I need to just full screen this again? A little tired today, guys, a little tired. So, as I've said, right, the Renaissance period, they didn't think of themselves as Renaissancists. This is something we call them later. You know, periodization, bit of a kind of a 19th century fad, histories, periods. But there are two main elements, right? A lot of Latin and Greek culture, natural developments in natural science, a lot of it coming again from contact with the Arab world. Return to focus on, again, as I've said, like an oration on the dignity of man. We return to the idea of the human being as a being with potential, as a being with dignity, as a being with rights, and not just entirely focused on the afterlife, as it were. The idea in the Renaissance and later in the Enlightenment, of course, is that education and human development is key to human progress. Garter says, in the background, you have a number of things kind of pushing the technology pushing these ideas forward, causing cultural shifts. The compass, firearms, and the printing press. Garter's a little bit too soft on the idea of voyages of exploration. They were voyages of conquest. But the printing press is pretty significant, obviously, at the mass production and distribution of ideas. You open up the potential for mass literacy. Literacy rates in Europe at the time were extremely low. Mass literacy, in a way, in and of itself, mass literacy took centuries and was viewed as a completely radical idea. The idea that 99% of your population should read. People in the 13th century would have been like, what are you even talking about? The common peasant certainly can't read. So you get lots of figures in the Renaissance who are kind of, you say Renaissance man, what does that mean? It means you dabble into a little bit of everything. Petrarch is a great example, a poet, a scholar, a collector of old manuscripts, a translator, a commentator on the classics of antiquity. So when we say humanism, we're also talking about the humanities, which is the idea that the study of art, literature, poetry, theater, these are all things that are really important to the development and progress of ourselves as really as a species. That we're supposed to be more ethical, that we're supposed to be more creative, we're supposed to be really examining human potential across the panoply, the things we are, the things we can be. It was Terence, not Horace. I'm so sorry. It's the ancient Roman playwright Terence wrote, "Homo sum humani alienum puto." I am human. I think nothing human is alien to me. Terence was a Roman slave, Berber, which is North Africa. The Roman senator, educated in freedom, was very common for slavery. Was very different in the Roman Empire than, for example, the chattel slavery of the kind of colonial, pre-Civil War United States, of course, right? It was very common to educate your slaves, there may be a scribe, for example, to be a tutor to your own children, and then to eventually free her. So it was not uncommon. Terence's situation was not too uncommon. And the quote here, "I am human and I think nothing human is alien to me," is kind of the Renaissance attitude. It celebrates that we are humans. Humans are good. Humans aren't bad. We're good, and we can become even better. Of course, the rediscovery of ancient pagan texts was going to come into conflict with established religious dogma. So you have a period of kind of, whereas first there was church patronage of people like Petrarch, eventually the Renaissance came into conflict with the church, right? Petrarch famously climbed mountains just to do it, which people are like, why are you doing it? Just for fun, I'm climbing a mountain. So these are big changes happening historically. The works of Lucretius rediscovered around this period, right? Pretty much anti-clerical. He says, "Tantum religio potuit suadere malorum," to such heights of evil has religion been able to drive men. Like Lucretius We talked about Lucretius earlier on, right? Part of the kind of Epicureans, part of the atomists. There's only atoms in the void. Death is annihilation. There is no afterlife, but it's nothing to be feared. And you know, religion and religion is bad. So obviously, translating and studying these texts is going to bring you in conflict with kind of establishment religion at the time. I'm going to skip a few of these. We should talk a little bit about Renaissance science as well, because it's a very important part of the historical development. There was a renewed interest in classical texts, but not because anything ancient is authoritative. In fact, the fact that we rediscovered a huge diversity of opinion of the ancient world showed people that appeal to authority is not necessarily the way to go. Just because something is old, just because something is traditional doesn't make it right. Look at all the ancients disagreeing amongst themselves. And pure reason unaided by the senses maybe doesn't help. So what we have is a resurgence of empiricism and experiment here. As Galileo said, measure what can be measured and make measurable what cannot be measured. There was, for example, one of the really nice examples of kind of the new Renaissance science pushing things forward was kind of an empirical test of Aristotle's physics. So Aristotle, as we saw last week, was viewed as like the philosopher, for example, by Aquinas. And Aristotle made a bunch of acclaim in his books on physics. Aristotle wrote on physics, looks like high school physics. He claimed, amongst other things, that heavier objects would fall faster than lighter ones, which isn't true. All objects fall at the same rate, give or take air friction. Galileo wrote a book, and he was actually kind of puzzled by this. He said, look, if I attach a rope between a heavy object and a light one, would the light one slow down the heavy object, or would the heavy one speed up the lighter one? What's going to go on? And you know, you can test these theories. You can also test Aristotle's theories on the parabola, on inertia, on momentum, and you find out Aristotle's his physics are just wrong. They're an intuitive physics, but Aristotle did not actually conduct any experiments. He just kind of sat down and wrote his book on physics. Here I have a video where the Apollo 15 astronauts drop a feather in a rock on the moon. They both fall at exactly the same rate because there's no atmosphere on the moon, so there's no air friction. Showing that. Gardner has an example here also about Aristotelian physics. It's a little bit more complicated than the gravity one. So Aristotle argued that an object would move in a straight line until it ran out of energy, and then would just fall straight down. So for Aristotle, you throw something, it should go like whoop, bang, straight down when it runs out of energy. But Galileo experimentally showed that, of course, gravity's effect on a moving body caused it to move in a parabola, which is like a curve. Right, so things don't fall straight down suddenly. Let me get my pointer here. Right, they move in a curve. So that's what Gardner's example in the book is all about. Things move in a parabola. Things move like a Tool song. Anybody listen to Tool? Is that too old a heavy metal reference? Moving on. So yeah, lots of Renaissance science. I'm going to start skipping over slides a little bit. There's Newton. Let me just shout out this really fun model of gravity over here. You can kind of like choose massive objects and simulate Newtonian gravity around them. This is kind of pre-Einstein equations. But this is a really fun little physics simulator. Just to give you a sense of what people were starting to work on, like mathematical modeling and empirical observation in the new science. Later in the Renaissance period, we also have really destructive religious wars, 30 Years' War particularly. This also has to do in part with the printing press, the mass distribution of the Bible, the Protestant Reformation, which also can't be separated out from the printing press, causing like really difficult sectarian religious warfare in Europe at the time. And kind of the unprecedented carnage there did lead to greater skepticism about the church, about the church's role in politics, and slowly kind of pushed, especially after the Peace of Westphalia, pushed towards the idea of a secular nation state. That is, a state that is separate from the religious body that may be predominant geographically there. But you start getting pushes towards religious freedom and you definitely start getting a separation between church and state, moving away from theocracy and slowly towards, very slowly towards modern nation-state democracy, partially as a result of the religious wars kind of set off basically by the Protestant Reformation. So, again, like I said, Gardner argues that intellectual, cultural, technological shifts kind of made the Protestant Reformation more or less inevitable, right? And it is a pretty straight line to argue that the humanism of the Renaissance suggests, right, you're focusing on the individual, you're focusing on the innate dignity of each individual man. It kind of suggests that the individual's relationship to God should come first, not unless the Catholic Church, which said you need the church, you need the priest to kind of be the intermediate between you and your relationship with the divine. And you can read scripture by yourself, because a Bible is no longer an expensive thing thanks to the printing press, right? Translating the Bible to the kind of the vulgar tongue, either the Latin Vulgate and eventually the popular tongue, for example, German, was pretty radical at the time. That you could just print and mass distribute copies really changed everything, because you didn't need to like have a very expensive handwritten copy. So huge cultural changes. So Luther in the Protestant Reformation should not be understood outside of the context of the Renaissance. But Luther is himself obviously not kind of a humanist deeply influenced by the Greco-Roman pagan texts. Luther, maybe, I don't know if he read Lucretius or not, but certainly didn't agree with it. So, as I've said, while the Romans would say, and the humanists would say, I am human and nothing human is alien to me, Luther clearly thought the fall from grace defined the sinful nature of mankind. And as well, I can't talk about Luther and religion in Europe at the time without mentioning, at least in passing, the anti-Semitism of Luther, who wrote a very long tract, a book, essentially calling for the extermination of European Jews, which played, of course, European anti-Semitism is very old, but Luther played a pretty big role here. And in the 20th century, 500 years later, Julius Streicher, who had a kind of a tabloid, Der Stürmer, like just a Nazi tabloid, said, I have a book written by Luther, right? He wrote a book called The Jews and Their Lies, and that we should burn down the synagogues and destroy them, which is true. Luther does say this in his book. So while the Renaissance, we can emphasize the positive as well, the ideas of religious tolerance are coming to the fore, the secular state is coming to the fore, the focus on the individual, on human progress. You also had counter movements at the time as well, and that we can't lose sight of these, because for example, we can't understand the Second World War and the Holocaust in isolation. We can't understand that outside of the context of European anti-Semitism, which is hundreds, if not thousands of years old, unfortunately. To understand history, hopefully, is not to repeat the awful mistakes history has made. You can read about this at the Wikipedia link. So Gardner also talks about the Baroque period, which is kind of a late Renaissance art era. Kind of a transition towards the Enlightenment. And the way he roughly has periodization set up is, right, so we're talking classical antiquity, right, Greco-Roman, right, era, 700 BC to 549 CE, when the Roman Empire falls. We have the Middle Ages, roughly 500 to 1299, Renaissance, 1300 1599, Baroque period, 16 to 1750, and the Enlightenment is just 100. You notice these periods are getting shorter and shorter the closer we get to the present day, which makes sense because we're closer to them, more is happening as well. And the further things are in the past, the more we tend to just kind of lump them together. In fact, it's kind of a useful intellectual exercise when you read the news to imagine what's happening today from the perspective of somebody living 50 years from now. What would you write it? How would you write it? Imagine 2020 from the perspective of the year 2400. Imagine the 20th century or the 21st century from the perspective of 1,000 years from now, right? How do you think of history? And to me, it's a really useful exercise in kind of getting perspective and understanding the moment. So in terms of philosophers, Baroque philosophers, right? So we call this the early modern period, usually in the scholarly literature, not the Baroque period. So we're talking about Descartes, Hobbes, Blaise Pascal, Pascal's Wager, Spinoza. Gardner also talks about Locke, Hume, and Berkeley over in Britain. Doesn't want to include Kant. It's not wrong. Periods are more or less made up. But the Baroque period, as a late Renaissance period, becomes a little bit more pessimistic, which again makes sense. We are coming out of very deadly European warfare. So right, you have the memento mori here, remember you will die. Right, and again, if you think about a more individualistic period, death is the most important fact about your life. We're all hurtling towards an inevitable death, and reflection on it was just kind of part of being cultured in a way. So Gardner argues there's kind of a self-consciousness intrinsic to the Baroque era. Right, and he quotes Shakespeare, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. One man in his time plays many parts. Upon the stage is played a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." So we're really self-conscious, slightly pessimistic age. We're starting to get a sense of humanity's place in the grand scheme of things, which again makes sense because as we kind of become more skeptical about religion, about the all-powerful theocratic state, and we become more individualistic, we feel smaller in a much larger universe. So all this kind of makes sense. It will really culminate in, for example, the thought of Nietzsche, who really directly confronts the problem of nihilism after the death of God. But for the Baroque period, God is not quite yet dead, as Nietzsche famously proclaimed later on. Okay, materialism. So let's talk about Descartes then. And let me do this by distinguishing between kind of monism and dualism in philosophy. A materialist holds that there's only one kind of substance, they're a monist, one kind of thing. And the universe is just a complex mechanism, a bit like a watch. The problem here is that a mechanistic, materialistic monism, say that 5 times fast, the view that there's only material substance obeying physical law threatens human freedom, threatens the idea of free will, and frankly is not really compatible with our understanding of ourselves as conscious creatures. Right? We're not just mechanisms, we're people. So Descartes advocates, and we're getting into what, 1596, 1650, so later on during the Renaissance, Baroque basically, as I said, early modern, is going to say the way out of this puzzle that science has put us in, that there's only matter in the universe acted on by forces which we model mathematically, right? How do we save free will? How do we save our humanity from a mechanistic science? Dualism, right? We are two kinds of things. We are material and spiritual. We are mind and matter. So how is Descartes going to argue for dualism? Let me focus here on Descartes' thought, because how am I doing for time? Let me just check my clock. 25 minutes. Not bad. So René Descartes, French philosopher, advocates for a position amongst others called dualism. How does he get to dualism? How does he try to save the idea of free will and the soul from mechanistic material science? Well, he starts over from scratch, which is a really important fact about Descartes. He doesn't really rely on Aristotle. He doesn't really start from, well, the Bible is true, therefore, right? He's going to start more or less from scratch. Of course, that's impossible, really, because you're always going to be influenced by something. You are a product of your time, no matter how hard you try not to be, right? He wrote on physics, he wrote on optics, he's clearly influenced by science. He wants to make room for science. It's very important for Descartes that, whatever philosophy you end up approaching, whatever you advocating, adopting, there has to be room for science. But it can't threaten humanness, which is kind of the Renaissance aspect of Descartes. So he embraces rationalism over empiricism, which is interesting, but he does it to defend science. So whereas Galileo was kind of an empiricist, observation, you measure what you can, Descartes says, no, the ultimate source of knowledge is reason, not observation. We need reason to secure the truth of observation, right? So Descartes' method is to start from a firm foundation, rationalism, not empiricism. So how do we do that? How do we use pure reason to find a secure foundation for knowledge? So Descartes kind of worked backwards in the sense that he used a method we kind of now call methodological skepticism. So the method was to be skeptical, methodological skepticism. So how do I know anything for sure? We could look at possible answers. Do I know for sure that this is a hand and this is another hand? Well, maybe, maybe not. Can I be skeptical about my hands? Is there anything that's doubt-proof? How do I know I have hands? It looks like I do, but what if I don't? Descartes says, because what can be doubted? Descartes says pretty much anything can be doubted. Like my hands here, right? Obviously what I've just heard I can doubt. What I've assumed I can doubt. The theories I have, maybe they're not true. And even everything I've seen, heard, and smelled, my hands could be an illusion. I could be dreaming, Descartes says. I could be deceived by an illusion crafted by a powerful demon. Right? In more modern terms, we could just be living in the Matrix. Right? This could be a computer simulation. Right? I might not have hands at all. What I am is a brain in a vat. So pretty much everything can be doubted, Descartes says. Right down to mathematics, actually. How can I doubt the truths of math? Maybe I'm just confused. Right? Ever make a mistake in your calculations in your high school math classes, and you're like, what's 53 plus 47? And you're like, oh, shit, 50, I'm so bad at math. Oh my gosh, it's a 90. And you make a mistake, but you think you got the right answer, and then you realize you made a mistake, but you were really sure beforehand. So how do you know you haven't made a mistake in all your calculations? You don't. Right? So you get rid of math, you get rid of logic, you get rid of sense observation. You definitely get rid of sense, because you could be in an illusion. You could be living in a simulation. So you could doubt everything. Is there anything left that you can't doubt? Descartes says, wait, there's one thing. There is someone doing the doubting. Doubting exists. Doubting is a kind of thought. Therefore, I must exist to be doubting, even if I exist in an illusion. Right? This is the meaning of the famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. As I approach methodological skepticism, I systematically remove all the beliefs that can even have the smallest, tiniest little sliver of doubt. Even if I'm like 99.999999% sure that reality isn't a simulation, I have to get rid of the belief because there's a tiny chance, vanishingly small chance, that my belief is wrong. But there's no way I'm wrong that I'm thinking these thoughts. Right? There's no way I'm wrong that there is me having doubt. Right? Is it self-contradictory to believe that I don't exist because here I am existing and thinking? Right? I can't doubt the thought of I'm doubting everything. Are We Living in a Simulation by Nick Bosho. I'm going to skip this slide, go back to it. It's just an argument that Descartes' skepticism might not be as far-fetched as we might think. So Descartes' skepticism obviously is going to extend to sense perception, and he attacks empiricism. And the conclusion he draws is rationalistic. It does not depend on sense experience. We reason our way to cogito ergo sum. Because even if I'm being deceived about everything, something is experiencing the deception. I am. I'm thinking. Therefore I exist. So, but what is it to exist, Descartes says? This is where we get into dualism, right? I can't know my physical body exists. That can be doubted, right? Because material reality can be doubted in the context of absolute methodological skepticism. So when I say I think, therefore I am, all I can know is that there's thinking substances, thought, there is mind, right? Identical things share properties, right? Because, right, if I'm describing to you two identical things just called by the different names, like Dwayne Johnson and The Rock, right? Dwayne Johnson and The Rock are the same thing, therefore they have all the same properties. Now Descartes says mind and body, soul and matter have to be distinct, because while I can doubt the existence of matter and body, I cannot doubt the existence of mind, right? And if one can be doubted, but the other one cannot, mind and body are not identical, because they have different properties. So mind and body are distinct. Thus, dualism. I can doubt body, but I cannot doubt mind. So, we are fundamentally minds first. But Descartes doesn't stop there. Right? I know that I am a mind, I cannot be doubted. If I'm a mind, I'm characterized by the fact that I can have ideas. I have thought. The experiences my mind might be of false things. I might have experiences of an illusion. But reasoning about thoughts that don't depend on experience are still valid. One idea my mind can entertain is that of a perfect being, etc., etc. Sounds familiar. Descartes does use the ontological argument in the Meditations. So if I can think of the ontological argument, I know two things. I know that I exist, cogito ergo sum, and if I can think thoughts, I can think of the most perfect being. And if I can think of the most perfect being exists, therefore God exists. So boom, I got two things I know. There's two things you can know, Descartes says. You can know that your mind exists and you can know God exists. But however, if you know God exists, God is the most perfect being. Now, are perfect beings going to deceive you, make you live in an illusion? Of course not. They're perfect. All right? It would be bad to deceive you, and perfect beings don't do bad things because they're perfect. So therefore, our perceptions, thanks to God, do correspond to reality. So what Descartes has done here is say, rationalism ultimately grounds knowledge. Rationalism tells us we are minds capable of conceiving of the ontological argument, thus proving God. And if God is a perfect being, he wouldn't deceive us. And if we're not being deceived, we can trust sense observation. But ultimately, the trustworthiness of sense experience is due to my rationalistic argument from the cogito to the ontological argument, to the justification of sense perception. All right, so that's how that happens. Descartes, I have slides here about how Descartes deals with optical illusions, but I'm going to try to cut some stuff here. Interestingly enough, John Buridan around 1350, 300 years before Descartes, kind of anticipated some of this discussion and said, you don't know whether or not God would deceive you or not. You cannot know the will of God, so you cannot be certain about anything. It's a funny little... we often teach Descartes as if he just came up with all this new stuff out of nowhere, but he really didn't. John Beard, you can read that slide too. I'm going to get a little bit fast. We'll go a little bit faster here. So Descartes, as I've said, was a dualist. Now the Epicureans, such as Lucretius, who were rediscovered and studied during the Renaissance period, held that the universe was material, right? Where there's atoms and there is void, right? This is a monistic kind of physicalism. Monism means there's only one kind of substance. Now there are many varieties of monism, right? There's physicalist monism, which says that all that exists is matter, and what we experience as mind, as the mental, is just a specific configuration of matter. Maybe the brain is like a computer, right? I know for a fact that my computer, when I'm playing a video game, right, is just matter in a specific configuration, right? It's a computer chip, right? It's a motherboard, it's a hard drive, it's electricity, but it's just all the process is material. And likewise, the physical monist would say mind itself is just matter in a specific configuration that is doing things that are pretty wild, that are pretty intense, but are possible if you configure matter the right way. There's also another kind of monism called idealism, which is the view that matter doesn't exist, only mind exists, and matter is some kind of illusion. So a guy like this would be, for example, Bishop Berkeley. I might talk about Berkeley in this class, maybe next week. So we're not going to talk about neutral monism, don't worry about it. So, but Descartes rejected monism in favor of dualism. There are two sorts of things in the world. There is mind and matter. Human beings are different from animals who we thought of as machines because we are unique, we are composed of both. Our mind directs our physical bodies through free will. So we can keep the mechanistic picture of the physical world, preserving science, without compromising human freedom because we are two things. We are composites of matter and mind. We are bodies and souls, Descartes says. So the mind must be fundamentally different because we have free will. We have consciousness, we have subjective perception, which would not be possible if we were just a machine, right? If I take a picture with my smartphone, beep, and the picture is of something red, my phone is not experiencing red. If I see something red, I experience red. So mechanisms don't have experiences. We have experiences, therefore we are not mechanisms. Further, all matter occupies space. Mind does not. A thought doesn't take up space, Descartes argues. Matter is divisible to smaller parts. Mind is not. Mind thinks. Matter doesn't think. So dualism seems like a really good solution. There's mind, there's body. They have distinct properties. They must be distinct substances. In other words, a substance is a fundamental component of reality. So it's not like, don't think of mind and matter as being different the way two elements like, I don't know, gold and helium are different. Gold and helium are fundamentally material things. They're the same kind they're part of the same kind of substance. They're part of matter. They're matter in different configurations, but it's matter. Mind is fundamentally different from matter for Descartes. Right? So dualists like Descartes said there must be two kinds of stuff. Material substance, extended in space, subject to mechanistic laws. Mental substance, unextended thought, not subject to physical laws. But we have a problem with this view almost immediately, however useful it sounds in terms of like, and intuitive it sounds, because it certainly feels to me like I'm a body with a mind, which is that if they're ontologically distinct substances, how do they interact? Okay, I mean, I decide to raise my hand, I wiggle my fingers, it moves around. How? How did the non-material affect the material? Right? Because they're just fundamentally different sorts of things. What kind of causal relations can bridge that gap between the fact that they're two different substances, right? In particular, if mind is unextended, but body is extended, in other words, if matter takes space up, but mind doesn't, suppose you have a mechanistic picture, which is mostly contact physics, like you bump into something and you make it move. The mind can't bump the body to make the arm move. It can't bump it because it's not a physical thing. So how does it do it? So how do we explain interaction between mind and body if the mind operates independently of the material world in its own realm? Descartes didn't really have a good solution. One of his most ferocious critics on this was Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, whose correspondence, their correspondence was kind of recently translated and published. Descartes maintained extensive letters and correspondence, which is another kind of the hallmarks of the Renaissance, early modern period. You have a huge amount of mail going back and forth between different thinkers, philosophers, kings, scientists, princesses. And Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia really is a philosopher in her own right by any standard. And Descartes said, I don't know how they interact. Maybe it's just a brute property of the soul, right? It's just a property that can affect matter, much like weight is a property of matter that can make things fall. The Princess Elizabeth was not really convinced. And of course, as a side note, I really want to point out that you had an important rise in women philosophers in the early modern period as education and printing made things more accessible, and as like the rigidity of social organization slowly started to give way. You had lots of early kind of Greco-Roman women philosophers, from Hypatia is a great example, Xanthippe, but they really returned to the scene in a big way in the early modern period. So here's a letter to Descartes written in 1643, translated, where Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia presses Descartes on the interaction problem of dualism. Given that the soul of a human being is only a thinking substance, how can it affect the bodily spirits to bring about voluntary actions? The question arises because it seems to me that how a thing moves, in your own physics, depends solely on how much it is pushed, the manner in which it is pushed, or the surface texture and shape of the thing that pushes it. Again, this is contact mechanics. It was the dominant physics of 1643. You don't have Newton yet. You don't have spooky action at a distance. No Newtonian physics yet. So you have contact mechanics. The first two of these require contact, and the third requires the causally active thing to be extended, in other words, to exist in space. Your notion of the soul excludes extension. Immaterial things can't possibly touch. So I ask you for a definition of the soul that hones in on its nature more thoroughly than does when you give it your meditations. I want one that characterizes what it is as distinct from what it does, namely to think. So I think this PDF should load here. If you're interested in the correspondence, Elizabeth really definitely finds the weak point in dualism and just hammers it. It's a great correspondence. She's amazing. Descartes did not have a good answer. He thought maybe the pineal gland was like an antenna or something, which also doesn't make sense, because if an antenna is going to receive a signal, the signal's got to be material. Descartes doesn't have an answer. Some of Descartes' followers adopted different views here. There's something called occasionalism. I think that's Malebranche's view, which is when you have a thought in your mind, God intervenes in the physical world on every occasion, hence occasionalism. On every occasion of thought, God basically makes a small miracle and causes the motion to occur. So according to occasionalism, my mental substance wants me to wiggle my fingers, and now God is making this matter move. Other philosophers adopted other solutions. For example, Leibniz argued for something called pre-established harmony, which is that God set the universe in motion with everything planned out in advance, such that my mind decides to raise my hand, and at the Big Bang or whatever, the causal setup of the universe made it inevitable that my arm would raise at the exact moment. All right, so that's pre-established harmony. So you have various solutions here trying to preserve dualism against a problem of interaction here. None of them super satisfactory. In fact, to this day, it's very easy to be a casual dualist. Of course, I'm a soul in a body. But what about the interaction problem? Okay, does the interaction problem show monism must be true? We don't know. Look, we don't know how conscious experience arises from the brain. Dualism could be true, monism could be true. The fact is, we don't know. We don't have a clue how any of this works. Dualism doesn't seem like it would work. Monism, how do you explain subjective conscious experience occurring and arising from otherwise inert matter? Consciousness seems to just slip from our grasp no matter how much we know about our brain. If I knew everything about, say, the brain of a bat, do I know what it's like to echolocate? Well, no, because there's the experience of echolocation, which is distinct from being able to tell you, well, this neuron is firing. But what is it like to have the experience? So if science won't tell you what the experience is like, even with perfect knowledge of the bat brain, then there's something science can get that knowledge of the matter won't get you. All right, so how do you explain subjective conscious experience using a material vocabulary alone? We don't know. So I'm not a dualist. I think probably I'm a monist. I think we're just my personal opinion is that, you know, maybe the brain not understanding itself makes sense, because if the brain was simple enough to understand itself, it'd be too simple to understand itself, right? But the fact is, this is still a mystery to me. I don't know how experience can arise from a configuration of matter. Like, it doesn't matter, like I said before, my phone doesn't experience color when it takes a picture. If I just have a complicated enough phone, will it start experiencing things? What does complicated mean in this context? It's all very, again, it's all very mysterious. Here's a great video called The Hard Problem of Consciousness, starring philosopher David Chalmers. We call it the hard problem in the business because it is. It's the hardest problem. Philosophers call it the hard problem of consciousness because we just don't know. So head over to the discussion forums if you'd like. We can talk a little bit about this content. If you would like, let me just go to the content module here for this week, week 6. Right? Send a comment if you want. Oh my gosh, is it hidden? Oh, I'm so bad at Fanshawe Online sometimes. Now it's visible. Very sorry. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'm heading out. Thanks for watching.